Something happened in a conversation you weren't there to hear, and your soulmate walked away from it seeing you through completely different eyes. Not because someone praised you, not because they suddenly decided they missed you. Something far more unsettling happened. A person your soulmate trusted enough to believe without questioning finally revealed a piece of your story that had been sitting outside their understanding this entire time. And now they are going backward through every memory you shared, wondering how they could have been so wrong about you. You need to understand this. The revelation wasn't necessarily about something you did. It may have been about something you carried, something you never explained because you didn't want sympathy, because you didn't want another argument, or because you believed your soulmate would eventually understand without you having to expose everything. But they didn't understand. They filled the empty spaces with their own assumptions. When you became quiet, they created a reason. When you pulled away, they created another. When you stopped explaining yourself, they decided you had stopped caring. And now someone has finally walked into that missing space and told them what you couldn't. Imagine staring at a photograph you've had for years and suddenly someone points to a detail in the background that changes the entire meaning of the picture. The photograph never changed. The truth was already there. You simply didn't know where to look. That's what happened to your soulmate. When conversation forced them to reconsider moments they thought they understood completely. They are remembering your silence differently now. They're remembering your distance differently. They're remembering the way you looked at them, the things you refused to say, and the moments when you seemed strangely calm, even though something deeper was happening inside you. And now one question keeps returning to them. What else did they know about me that I never understood about them? Because the person they trusted didn't just reveal information about you. They revealed a missing piece of the story. And once your soulmate sees where that piece belongs, they may realize the version of you they believed in was never the complete one. Now the part they were told begins to sink in. And this is where the entire story starts feeling different to your soulmate. Because what they learned wasn't some random detail they could hear once and forget. It connected directly to the moments between you that never made sense to them. Suddenly the silence has a reason. The distance has a reason. The hesitation, the emotional walls, the moments when you seemed like you wanted to say something but stopped yourself. All of it begins forming one picture. And the person who revealed this truth may have said something simple, something your soulmate never expected to hear. You never knew what they were going through. Those words can hit harder than an accusation because they force someone to reconsider every assumption they made about you. Your soulmate may have believed you were intentionally pulling away. They may have thought you were becoming cold, losing interest, or trying to make them chase you. But now they are realizing that what looked like distance may have actually been protection. You weren't necessarily trying to make them feel your absence. You may have been trying to protect yourself from saying something you would later regret. Imagine finding a locked room inside a house you thought you knew perfectly. You've lived around that house, walked through its hallways, recognized every window, every door, every familiar corner. Then someone suddenly tells you there was a room you never knew existed. That's what this revelation feels like to your soulmate. They are discovering that there was an entire emotional part of your life happening behind a door they never opened. And now they want to know what was inside. They may be asking, why didn't they tell me? But the answer may be more complicated than they expect. Maybe you didn't tell them because you were afraid they wouldn't understand. Maybe you had already tried to communicate before and felt unheard. Maybe you didn't want to make them feel responsible for your emotions. Or maybe there were things you were protecting them from because you believed revealing everything would only create more pain. Sometimes people don't stay silent because they have nothing to say. They stay silent because they have too much to say and no safe place to put it. Your soulmate may be realizing that now, and that realization can completely change the emotional meaning of your past. They may remember a conversation where you suddenly became quiet and realized you weren't bored. You were holding something back. They may remember a message you answered differently than usual and wonder what you were feeling at that exact moment. They may remember when you seemed distant while standing right beside them, and finally understand that physical closeness doesn't always mean emotional peace. There may even be a moment they replay over and over because they now recognize the look in your eyes differently. Before they saw mystery, now they see pain. Before they saw rejection, now they see restraint. Before they thought you were choosing to leave them out, now they may understand that you were struggling to find a way to stay without losing yourself. And this is where the regret begins to enter quietly. Because your soulmate isn't only discovering what you felt, they are realizing how their own assumptions may have affected the way they treated you. They may remember moments when they judged you without asking questions. Moments when they became defensive instead of curious. Moments when they assumed they knew your intentions instead of giving you space to explain them. The truth can be uncomfortable when it arrives after the damage has already happened. Imagine spending months blaming someone for closing a door, only to discover later that they were standing behind that door trying to protect something fragile. You don't just regret the closed door. You regret never asking why it was closed. That may be where your soulmate is emotionally now. They are not simply thinking about what you did. They are thinking about what they failed to notice. And there is a huge difference. One makes someone defensive. The other makes someone reflective. They may start questioning the entire timeline of your connection. When did you first become hurt? When did you start hiding your feelings? When did you stop believing they would understand? How long were you carrying something they never knew existed? Those questions can become difficult to escape because every answer leads back to the same realization. They never had the complete story. They had pieces. They had assumptions. They had their own interpretation of events, but they didn't have your side of the emotional truth. And now someone else has given them a piece of it. That doesn't mean this person knows everything about you either. It simply means they revealed enough to make your soulmate realize that their previous understanding was incomplete. That distinction matters, because the most powerful part of this revelation isn't necessarily the secret itself. It's what the secret does to everything your soulmate already believed. One truth can change the meaning of 100 memories. Suddenly, the moment you walked away isn't just abandonment. The silence isn't indifference. The distance isn't necessarily rejection. The unanswered question isn't proof that you didn't care. And perhaps the most painful realization of all is that you may have been hoping they would notice what you couldn't bring yourself to say. Now they're finally noticing it, but only after someone else had to explain it to them. And that is why this conversation is staying in their mind. They didn't simply learn something new about you. They discovered that there was a version of your story they had never bothered to search for. And once that realization settles in, your soulmate may begin wondering what else they misunderstood. What other truths were hidden behind your silence, and whether the person they thought they knew was actually carrying far more love, pain, and emotion than they ever imagined. And now the revelation starts doing something your soulmate never expected. It forces them to question their own version of the story. Until this moment, they may have been comfortable believing they understood what happened between you. They had their explanation. They knew why you became distant, why you stopped opening up, why certain conversations ended strangely, and why the connection eventually became difficult. But suddenly, one piece of information has made that explanation feel incomplete. They are beginning to realize that they may have judged your actions without ever knowing what was happening underneath them. And that realization can be deeply uncomfortable because it means some of the conclusions they made about you may have been completely wrong. They may have thought your silence meant you didn't care. Though they are wondering if your silence actually meant you cared too much to say something that could hurt both of you. They may have believed your distance was rejection. Now they are questioning whether you were protecting yourself, protecting them, or simply trying to survive emotions you didn't know how to express. Imagine watching the same movie twice, but the second time, someone tells you the ending before it starts. Suddenly every small detail looks different. A glance that seemed meaningless becomes important. A pause becomes a clue. A sentence you ignored suddenly sounds completely different. That is what is happening inside your soulmate's mind. They are replaying your history with new information, and every memory is being examined through a different lens. They may be thinking about one particular moment when you looked like you wanted to speak but chose not to. They may remember asking you what was wrong and hearing nothing, even though something was clearly there. They may remember how quickly you changed the subject, how carefully you avoided certain conversations, or how you seemed to know when to leave before an argument became something neither of you could take back. At the time, they may have seen those behaviors as confusing. Now they may see them as signs that you were carrying something silently. And that is where the emotional weight begins to build. Because your soulmate isn't only learning that you had feelings they didn't know about. They are realizing that those hidden feelings may have influenced the decisions they made around you. They may remember being colder because they thought you didn't care. They may remember pulling away because they believed you had already moved on. They may remember saying something harsh because they thought you were unaffected. And now they are asking themselves a painful question. What if I had known the truth back then? That question has no easy answer. Maybe the relationship would have changed. Maybe a conversation would have gone differently. Maybe one misunderstanding could have been corrected before it became something larger. Or maybe circumstances would still have taken you in different directions. But your soulmate doesn't know anymore, and uncertainty can be harder to carry than a definite ending. This is why the revelation feels so powerful. It doesn't simply give them information, it removes their certainty. Before, they could tell themselves they knew why things happened. Now they have to admit they didn't, and when someone loses certainty about the past, they naturally start examining everything they thought they knew. They may even begin questioning the person they trusted who revealed this information. Why did they know? How long did they know? Why didn't they tell me sooner? Was there something they were protecting? Was there something you asked them not to reveal? Or did they simply realize that the truth had become too important to keep hidden? These questions can create another layer of emotional tension, because now your soulmate is caught between two versions of reality. The old story they built and the new story they are slowly discovering. And the new story makes you look very different. Perhaps you weren't cold. Perhaps you were overwhelmed. Perhaps you weren't trying to make them jealous. Perhaps you were trying to hide how deeply their actions affected you. Perhaps you didn't walk away because you found someone better. Perhaps you walked away because staying inside the same emotional cycle was becoming unbearable. They may finally be understanding that the person they thought was distant was actually protecting something very fragile inside themselves. And that can create regret because people often treat silence as permission to assume. When someone doesn't explain themselves, others fill the empty space with whatever story makes sense to them. Your soulmate filled that space too. They created an explanation that allowed them to feel certain about what happened. Now that explanation is collapsing. They may be realizing that you were never as difficult to understand as they believed. They simply didn't have the information required to understand you. And perhaps the most painful part is that you may have wanted to be understood without having to expose every vulnerable part of yourself. You may have hoped that someone who truly cared would notice the difference between indifference and emotional exhaustion, between rejection and self-protection, between silence and surrender. But now, someone else has given your soulmate the missing context. And suddenly, the things you never said are speaking louder than anything you could have explained yourself. This is where your soulmate may begin feeling a completely different kind of longing. Not just longing for your presence, but longing for the opportunity to go back and understand you correctly. They may wish they could sit across from you and ask the questions they never asked before. They may want to know what you were really feeling during those moments. They may want to hear the truth directly from you. But the difficult reality is that understanding someone after the fact doesn't erase the moments when they needed understanding most. It can only teach you what you should have seen earlier. And that is why this revelation has changed everything overnight. Your soulmate didn't simply discover a secret about you. They discovered that the story they had been telling themselves about you was missing an entire chapter. Now they have to live with that knowledge. They have to revisit the memories. They have to question their assumptions. And somewhere in that process, they may finally realize something that changes the way they see the entire connection. They didn't lose you because they understood you too well. They may have lost you because they never understood what was happening behind your silence. And now, the attention begins shifting away from you and toward the person who revealed the truth. Because your soulmate is starting to ask a question they never thought they would ask. Why did this person know something about you that I didn't? That question can change the entire atmosphere overnight. At first, your soulmate may have simply listened. Maybe they were shocked, maybe confused, maybe even defensive. But after the conversation ended, the words stayed with them. They kept replaying what was said, testing it against their memories, trying to decide whether they should believe it. And the more they thought about it, the more pieces began fitting together. That's when curiosity turns into suspicion. They may start wondering how long this person knew, why they never mentioned it before, and whether there were other things they had been keeping quiet about. Imagine pulling one loose thread from a sweater and suddenly realizing that the thread is connected to dozens of others. One revelation doesn't always remain one revelation. It can lead to questions about everything surrounding it. Your soulmate may now be looking at that trusted person differently, not necessarily because they believe there was malicious intent, but because the information has exposed a gap in what they thought they knew. They may wonder whether the person stayed silent because they were protecting you, protecting them, protecting themselves, or simply waiting for the right moment. And perhaps the most interesting possibility is that they didn't reveal it because they didn't believe it was their story to tell. Maybe they watched you struggle quietly. Maybe they knew a part of what you were carrying. Maybe they heard something you never had the courage to say directly. And eventually, something happened that made keeping that truth hidden feel more wrong than revealing it. Your soulmate may be thinking, why now? Why did this information come out at this particular moment? Why after all this time? Why when they had finally started accepting the version of the past they believed? Sometimes truth arrives when people are finally capable of understanding it. If they had heard it earlier, they might have dismissed it. They might have defended themselves. They might have accused you of exaggerating. But now there is distance, there is silence, and there is enough time for them to see the situation from outside their own emotions. That can make the truth hit harder. They aren't hearing it in the middle of an argument anymore. They're hearing it after everything has settled. And that means there is nothing left to hide behind. No immediate conflict, no excuse to change the subject, no emotional reaction to distract them. Just the information and the memories it unlocks. They may begin thinking about how many people knew something they didn't. They may wonder whether someone else saw your pain before they did. They may even feel embarrassed that someone outside the connection understood a piece of you that they themselves failed to recognize. But the deeper issue isn't embarrassment. It's the realization that you may have been more vulnerable than you ever allowed them to see. And that can create a strange mixture of guilt and longing. They may wish they had been the person you trusted with that truth. They may wonder why you couldn't tell them. They may even feel hurt that someone else knew something so personal about you. But underneath that hurt is a much deeper question. Did I create an environment where they felt safe enough to tell me? That question can be painful because sometimes people don't hide their feelings because they don't trust the person. Sometimes they hide them because past experiences taught them that being vulnerable could lead to misunderstanding, rejection, or another argument. Your soulmate may now be recognizing that possibility. Maybe you weren't trying to keep secrets. Maybe you were trying to keep peace. Maybe you weren't trying to shut them out. Maybe you were trying to find a way to process everything without making the situation worse. And now the person they trusted has accidentally or intentionally opened a door you had kept closed. Once that door is open, your soulmate can't simply pretend they never saw what was inside. They may start looking at old conversations differently. They may remember questions they asked and wonder why you answered the way you did. They may remember moments when you seemed emotionally distant and realize that distance may have been a form of protection. They may remember your final interaction and suddenly understand why you didn't say everything you could have. This is where the trusted person's role becomes almost secondary, because the revelation has already done its job. It has forced your soulmate to stop looking at the surface and start looking underneath it. And perhaps the most important thing they are realizing is that the truth wasn't hidden because you were trying to deceive them. It was hidden because there were emotions you weren't ready, willing, or able to expose. That difference matters. There is a huge difference between hiding something to manipulate someone and keeping something private because you are still trying to understand your own heart. Your soulmate may finally be seeing that. They may also realize that the person who revealed the truth wasn't necessarily trying to create drama. Maybe they simply couldn't watch your story remain misunderstood forever. Maybe they believed your soulmate deserved to know what you couldn't say. Maybe they knew that without this information, your soulmate would continue believing something about you that was never completely true. And now that truth is out. The old narrative has cracks in it. Your soulmate can no longer comfortably return to the way they thought about you before. Something has shifted permanently. They may not know what they are going to do with this realization yet, but they know one thing. The person they trusted most has given them a truth about you that they can never unknow. And the deeper they think about it, the more they may realize that the real shock wasn't what they were told. The real shock was discovering how much of your story they had never understood in the first place. And now they are left with the one thing they cannot escape anymore. The truth has changed the way they see you. Your soulmate may not have every answer yet, and they may still be trying to understand why you kept certain feelings hidden. But one thing has become impossible to deny. They no longer see your silence the same way. What once looked like indifference may now look like pain. What looked like distance may now look like self-protection. What they once called rejection may now feel like a decision you made because you had reached the point where carrying everything alone was easier than continuing to explain yourself to someone who wasn't ready to understand. And that realization can create a very different kind of regret. It's not simply "I miss them," it's "I wish I had understood them when I still had the chance." Imagine standing in front of a door that you spent months believing was locked forever, only to discover that you were the one who never noticed the key. That's the feeling your soulmate may be experiencing now. They are looking back at opportunities that once seemed ordinary and realizing they may have been much more important than they understood. A conversation they dismissed, a message they didn't answer properly, a moment when you needed reassurance but didn't ask for it. A time when you walked away quietly instead of fighting for the last word. These memories can become painfully loud once the truth changes their meaning. They may even wonder whether you were waiting for them to notice without having to reveal everything yourself. And that question can stay with them because there is no way to go backward and respond differently. The past doesn't reopen simply because someone finally understands it. But understanding can change what happens next. Your soulmate may now feel an urge to reach out, to ask questions, to apologize, or simply to hear your side directly. Whether they actually do that depends on their courage. Regret can make someone move closer, but it can also make them freeze because admitting they were wrong requires vulnerability. They may be afraid that you no longer care. They may fear you have already healed. They may wonder whether they waited too long. And perhaps that's the deepest consequence of the revelation. They now understand that silence doesn't always mean the absence of love. Sometimes silence is what remains when someone has loved, hoped, explained, waited, and finally become too exhausted to keep repeating the same emotional conversation. Your soulmate may finally see that you weren't necessarily trying to punish them by walking away. You were trying to protect your heart from continuing to live inside a misunderstanding. The person they trusted revealed the missing piece, but now your soulmate has to decide what to do with it. They can continue defending the old story, or they can accept that the truth is more complicated than their pride wanted it to be. And if they choose honesty, they may finally understand you in a way they never did before. They may realize that the person they thought they lost because of distance was actually someone who had been quietly hoping to be understood. The revelation doesn't guarantee a reunion, and it doesn't erase everything that happened. What it does is remove the illusion. It gives your soulmate a clearer picture of what was happening behind the silence. And sometimes clarity is more powerful than any dramatic confession. Because once someone understands the reason behind your silence, they can't keep using that silence as evidence that you never cared. They have to face the possibility that you cared deeply and simply couldn't keep hurting in the same way. So if they are suddenly quiet, reflective, or distant, don't assume nothing is happening. Sometimes the loudest emotional shift happens inside someone who has finally realized they were looking at the wrong version of the story. They may be remembering you differently now. They may be missing you differently now. And most importantly, they may finally understand that the person they trusted to explain you wasn't you at all. The truth was always inside your silence. They just needed someone to finally show them where to look.